There was a light in the forest again that night, strange and pale against the dark backdrop of the forest. I saw it from my bedroom window, only for a moment. A lonely point moving between the trees, appearing and disappearing as the branches passed in front of it. I told myself it was a car on the road. It must be. Then I remembered, there's no road there. I looked over to my wife. She lay peaceful, carefree in the dim bedroom light. So I watched, silent and isolated, until it vanished. Many times I've wondered why I didn't grab my phone to film it, or take a picture. It's strange, but I almost wanted to be the only one to have a moment, a little piece of wonder just for me. I simply closed the curtains and stood in the darkness, listening to the quiet house around me. More than 40 years have passed since that night in Suffolk, but I still cannot look into the dark wood without searching for a light that should not be there. Memory is supposed to fade. Mine has only learned how to wait. Before the light appeared, it had been an ordinary night. That's the part people never understand. They expect nights like this to announce themselves. They imagine thunder, failing electricity, animals fleeing through the darkness. They imagine the world preparing you for what's coming, and it doesn't. The impossible arrives during conversations about coffee, cold feet, and how many hours remain until the end of a shift. Christmas had passed, although the base still carried traces of it. Paper decorations hung in rooms where nobody felt particularly festive. Somewhere behind the wire, men were playing cards and opening parcels that had arrived late from home. Outside, the temperature had fallen. The cold settled over RAF Woodbridge and the surrounding Suffolk countryside, hardening the ground and whitening the breath of anyone unlucky enough to be standing guard. Tonight I was one of the unlucky ones, at the east gate. I stood behind the satin steel and wire gate, the concrete and mesh fencing. My mind, starved of stimulation, replays moments from my past. An embarrassing pass at a woman, a fight in my teens. Beyond the barrier lay the forest and the dirt track, arcing lazily through the trunks and under the canopy. During daylight, it was nothing more than rows of commercial pine, tall, narrow trunks planted close together, tracks carved through the earth, fallen needles soft beneath your boots. At night it became something else. The trees crowded together like figures gathered around a secret. I'd been looking towards them without really seeing them when a light appeared above the tree line. At first, I thought it was an aircraft. That was the obvious explanation. We were stationed at an airbase. Aircraft moved through the sky. Lights appeared and disappeared. Engine noise carried strangely, echoing across the flat land. But this light was descending, not quickly, not like something falling out of control. It seemed to lower itself behind the forest, as if it was floating down on a calm breeze. I straightened. "Did you see that?" The man beside me followed my stare. "See what?" I pointed towards the forest. Another light appeared, red against the black sky. For a moment it remained still. Then it divided, or perhaps a second light became visible beside it. Red, blue, white. They moved among the trees, dancing playfully with each other. We watched in silence. Somewhere beyond the wire, the world continued as it always had. Men laughed, vehicles moved, radios crackled. I simply couldn't hear any of it anymore. No engine noise reached us. No impact followed. Nothing rose again. After what could have been minutes, I reached for my belt. The radio felt unusually heavy in my hand. I must have used that radio 100 times before. It never felt like I was holding the weight of a decision. I called it in as a possible downed aircraft. Even as I say the words, I knew they did not fit what I had seen. But what could I say? I couldn't tell myself what I'd seen, let alone my superiors. I looked over to my buddy. His eyes answered the question that I hadn't asked. We didn't know. Permission came back for a small patrol to investigate. There were 3 of us. We drove as far as the vehicle could comfortably take us through the trees, following the tracks towards them. The headlights swept across trunks and undergrowth, turning everything beyond their reach even darker. Nobody spoke. There was no need to admit that we were uneasy. Unease had already entered the car and sat next to us. As we approached the forest, the radio began to crackle. I lifted the handset. "Say again, over?" Only static replied. The driver glanced at me. "Is it dead?" "Must be interference." That was what I called it anyway. Interference sounded temporary. Interference belonged to the world we understood. The easy explanation. The vehicle stopped near the edge of the trees. From there, we continued on foot. The night closed around us immediately. The glare from the headlights lying to our eyes. Night vision slowly returned as we moved away into the darkness. Our torches revealed fragments. Wet bark, pale grass, our own boots. Beyond those small circles of light, the forest seemed endless. Somewhere ahead, a red light moved. It was difficult to judge its distance. At times it appeared close enough to reach within minutes. Then the trees shifted around and it seemed impossibly far away. We followed. The forest was not silent. Branches moved overhead. Our equipment knocked softly against our clothing. The ground cracked beneath our weight. But there were stretches where the sounds seemed to withdraw. Even our footsteps felt absorbed by the trees. The light brightened, red at its center, blue along one edge. A white glare that made me narrow my eyes. "It's still moving," someone whispered. I had already noticed. It did not move like a torch carried by a person. It did not sway or bounce. It passed between the trunks with a smoothness that made the forest appear to move around it. We continued. The sensible thing would have been to return to the gate. I have replayed that decision hundreds of times. People like to believe courage carried us forward. Duty, perhaps. Training. The truth is less flattering. We were curious. Fear tells you to run. Curiosity persuades you to take one more step. We came to a more open section of forest. The light was there. Not above us, not beyond the trees, there. For several seconds, my mind refused to give it a shape. It was simply brightness occupying a place where brightness should not have been. Then my eyes adjusted. Something appeared to be resting or hovering close to the ground. Metallic, compact, angular. Its surface reflected the surrounding trees, although the reflection seemed distorted, as though the forest continued inside it. Blue light pulsed along one side. A deep red glow filled the space beneath it. I stopped breathing. One of the other men moved behind me and said something that I couldn't really understand. The object was not enormous. That made it worse. If it had filled the clearing, my mind might have rejected it completely. A vast machine from another world would have belonged to fantasy. But this looked constructed, specific and real. A thing with dimensions, a thing that had arrived from somewhere. The air felt changed. Nobody told us to stop. Nobody needed to. We had all reached the same invisible line at exactly the same time. The hair on my arms rose beneath my sleeves. A faint vibration passed through my chest, more sensation than sound. I wanted to step back. Instead, I stepped forward. The light intensified. For a moment, the trunks cast long shadows behind us. Then the object moved. It did not turn. It slipped sideways beneath the trees. Benches trembled as it passed, although I could not tell whether it touched them. We followed for several paces. The red light flared. Every instinct in my body finally agreed on a single instruction. Stop. The object rose, then hesitated. Not like a machine waiting for instructions, more like something deciding whether it had seen enough of us. There was no roar of engines, no rush of air, no building force. One instant it was among the trees, the next it was climbing through them. Light flashed across the branches overhead, and then it was gone. We stared into the darkness it had left behind. Farther away, beyond the forest, a beacon continued to pulse. On, off, on, off. One of the men beside me said it might be the lighthouse. Perhaps part of what we saw was this. Perhaps all of it was. I've wished many times I could believe that without reservation. Daylight made the forest ordinary again. That felt insulting. The trees stood exactly where they had been before. Birds moved through their branches, the tracks filled with workers, police, and curious personnel. Nothing in the landscape acknowledged what we had believed had happened there. We returned to the clearing. 3 shallow impressions marked on the ground. They formed a rough triangle. Nearby, damage was reported on some of the trees. Small marks, broken bark, details that seemed enormous because we were searching for proof that the night had been real. Measurements were taken, photographs were discussed, statements were requested. A local police officer inspected the site and found nothing that convinced him an aircraft had landed there. The marks could have been animal activity. The lights could have come from the coast. The forest could have transformed distance, angle, and brightness into something strange. Each explanation was reasonable. Together they still felt incomplete. I wrote down what I remembered in my book. Lights in the trees, movement, colours, possible objects. Words are poor containers for experiences. The moment you write something down, it becomes smaller. Ink cannot produce the cold or the stillness. It cannot show the way 3 trained men stopped speaking at precisely the same moment. It cannot explain the certainty that something had noticed us. My statement looked insignificant on the page. I almost apologized for it. The forest did not remain quiet. 2 nights later, men returned after reports of strange lights near the original site. This time, the deputy base commander went with them. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt carried a small cassette recorder. His voice preserved part of that night. Not as a memory recalled years later, but as words spoken while the search was taking place. The recording begins almost casually. Then moving through the darkness, equipment being checked, radiation readings being called out near marks on the ground and the trees. Then the tone changes. A light is seen, red, moving, appearing to drip or shed glowing fragments. Through the recorder you can hear trained men trying to describe something that resists description. They move beyond the forest and into the open field. Lights appear in the sky. Some resemble stars. One lies to the south, in the direction of the brightest lights over the coast. Others appear to move. At one point, Holt reports that an object sending down beams of light. The words sound impossible. His voice does not. This is what stayed with me when I first heard the tape. He does not sound like a man telling a ghost story. He sounds occupied, alert, occasionally uncertain. A man attempting to perform his duty while the boundaries of that duty are challenged around him. The light continued to flash. One every few seconds. Regular enough to suggest a beacon. Strange enough from that position and on that night to keep them watching. Later, skeptics would compare the timing with the beam from the lighthouse. They would point towards bright stars, unusual atmospheric conditions, and the fireball seen over southern England around the time of the first incident. They would build an explanation from many ordinary things: a meteor, a lighthouse, stars, animal-made marks on the ground, human expectation, memory. It's a strong explanation. Perhaps it is the correct one. But an explanation can account for every piece of a story and still fail to reproduce the experience of those who lived it. Weeks later, Holt wrote a memorandum. Its title was almost deliberately plain: Unexplained Lights. The memo recorded 2 nights of unusual activity near RAF Woodbridge. Security personnel had seen lights descending into the forest. They had investigated what they initially believed might be a downed aircraft. They reported a glowing object, metallic in appearance, displaying coloured lights. It moved through the trees. Animals on a nearby farm became agitated. 3 impressions were found in the ground. Later, additional lights were observed, including objects described as star-like and one reported to have sent beams downwards. The memorandum did not declare an alien landing. It did not solve anything. It placed an extraordinary sequence of claims into the restrained language of military administration. The restrained gave the story power. Had the memento described visitors from another planet, could have been dismissed as fantasy. Instead, it merely recorded that something had happened, something unexplained. The Ministry of Defence did not consider the incident a threat to national security. That decision would be repeated in the years that followed. Perhaps it was sensible. No attack occurred. No aircraft was confirmed missing. No object was recovered. The base remained, the forest remained, and life continued. But those of us who entered the trees that night did not leave quite so easily. Stories do not remain still, they grow. Details surface years later. Witnesses remember events differently. Retellings merge. Certainty hardens around moments that were once confused. One man would eventually describe approaching close enough to examine and touch a triangular craft. He would speak of symbols on its surface, and much later, a sequence of binary numbers he believed had been entered into his mind. Those details were not all present in the earliest public accounts. That matters. It does not prove dishonesty. Memory is not a recording. Trauma, repetition, interviews, and the expectations of others can alter the shape of an event without the witness recognizing the change. But it means we must be careful. There is the incident as first reported. Then there is the legend Rendlesham became. The distance between those two things contains both wonder and danger. I sometimes wonder whether we saw something extraordinary and then buried it beneath decades of additions. I also wonder whether we saw ordinary lights and spent decades constructing an extraordinary object around them. Both possibilities disturb me. In one version, something unknown entered the forest. In the other, the human mind can manufacture certainty so powerful that it survives a lifetime. I do not know which is stranger. Years after the incident, I visited the coast. I wanted to see the lighthouse. The journey felt embarrassingly simple. Roads, signs, a car park, daylight. Nothing mysterious. I waited until evening. Across the darkening landscape, the beam began to pulse. On, off, on, off. From the correct angle, framed between distant trees, it became difficult to judge. A fixed light can appear to move when the observer moves. Branches can divide it. Mist can enlarge it. Expectation can transform it. I watched the beam and felt something loosen inside me. Relief is a strange emotion. Sometimes you welcome it, sometimes you resent it because it asks you to let go of the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to you. Here was an answer. Not necessarily the answer, but one I could carry. A lighthouse had been there in 1980. A meteor had crossed the sky. Bright stars had hung low over the horizon. Police had considered the marks in the forest unremarkable. Enough ordinary pieces existed to build an ordinary night. I should have felt relief. Instead, as I watched, the rhythm changed, or it seemed to. The beam disappeared once, and then darkness. I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. The light returned, perfectly regular, just as the skeptics had said. I smiled. Then, beneath one flash and the next, a second light appeared lower down, red, steady, near the tree line. I stopped smiling. It remained for perhaps 3 seconds, then it vanished. I told myself it was a vehicle, a reflection, a distant warning lamp. There are always more ordinary pieces. You can build almost anything for them. People still ask what I think happened in Rendlesham Forest. They expect a choice, alien craft or lighthouse, visitors or imagination, truth or lie. But nights like that do not divide themselves cleanly. I believe we saw a light entering the forest. I believe we followed it. I believe something moved between the trees. Beyond that, belief becomes unstable. The official record exists. So do the witness statements. So does Holt's recording. They prove that military personnel reported unusual things. They do not prove where those things came from. Perhaps a meteor drew our attention to the forest. Perhaps the lighthouse kept it there. Perhaps bright stars distorted by the atmosphere became moving objects. Perhaps fear connected them all. Or perhaps those explanations describe the scenery surrounding the event without describing the event itself. There is one moment I have never managed to dismiss. It happened before the light moved, before it rose through the trees, before we returned to the base and began the long process of turning an experience into paperwork. For several seconds, the object, or the light, or whatever stood in that clearing, remained completely still. We remained still too, and in that silence, I felt something never found words for. Not fear, not exactly. Recognition. I spent more than 40 years trying to find another word for that feeling. There isn't one. It wasn't fear. It wasn't awe. It wasn't the impossible certainty that we were not discovering it. Somehow, it already knew we were coming. It had simply been waiting for us to arrive. There was a light in the forest again last night. That's how this story began. It's the truth, although truth is not always useful. I watched it pass between the trees. I watched it disappear. This morning, I walked to the place where I thought it had been. There was nothing there. No damaged branches, no marks in the soil, no proof. Only trees, wet earth, and the distant sound of traffic. On the way home, I turned back once. The forest stood quietly beneath the grey morning sky, ordinary and empty. But I learned not to trust forests that look empty. Sometimes the thing watching you isn't hidden among the trees at all. Sometimes it's been living quietly inside your memory for decades, waiting patiently for another dark night, another lonely light between the trees, for you to look again.